welcome to Live Service Development in 2024, the Developer's Perspective, presented by AccelByte and Omdia. Let's start by introducing ourselves. So I have with me this morning Rob Scrubby, Chief Commercial Officer at AccelByte. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, Rob?
Yep. So super excited to be here. Hey, everyone. My name is Rob Scrubby, Chief Commercial Officer at AccelByte. I've been in the games industry for a little over 20 years. I think this is my 21st GDC, which is kind of crazy when I think about that. I got my start about 20 years ago in QA, and I moved from there to Bandai Namco Games, where I stayed for about 6 years, and I ran product development. Then moved to Sony for about 5 years, where I led content business development and helped launch the Xperia Play, which was a really cool phone back in the day, had a PlayStation controller slapped on the bottom. It was kind of at the forefront of mobile gaming at the time. And from there, I went to AWS, where I stayed for about 8 years. And at AWS, I managed the worldwide game tech business. And then about a year ago, I moved over to AccelByte. And the goal here is really to make sure that we are leaning in and helping support developers that are making live service games and providing them with all the tools that they need to be successful and remove all the heavy lifting so they can focus on the creative elements of actually making a game. And so, again, super excited to be here and super excited to go through some of the results that we've collected with Omdia over the past few months.
Yeah, and I am Liam Dean. I'm a principal analyst covering games tech at Omdia. I've been a technology analyst for a little over a decade, working at analyst firms, and also spent some time at Irdetto, digital platform security company that does a lot of work in the games industry. And the last few years, I've been working at Omdia, building out our research, looking at the development and technology ecosystem in the games market, which is a really interesting space that there hasn't been all that much in-depth research into until quite recently. And the sort of data and research that we're going to be talking through this morning is exactly the sort of work that we have been focusing on. So specifically, what we're going to be talking around is a survey that Omdia conducted in partnership with AccelByte in January and February of this year. So we surveyed 202 live service developers around the world in 4 different regions: North America, Nordics, Western Europe, and Asia Pacific. They came from a wide variety of studios. We had everything from solo developers, indie studios, AA, right up to AAA studios. So we have a real mix of perspectives in this data set. About 56% of the participants were in technical roles, and we also had people on the business and strategy as well in the sample, and 87% of our participants were senior decision makers at director level or higher. And key thing to emphasize, everyone who participated in this is a live service developer specifically, so people who have direct experience working in the live service market. So this has obviously given us a lot of really interesting insights into what is happening in this market and how developers see the space evolving. So let's kick off by looking at some of the challenges in live service development. We all know that it's not easy, but we want to dig into how developers specifically saw the challenges and pain points in live service development. So we asked developers to rank the key challenges, and this is what came out at the top of the list as the top challenges. It's interesting, actually, that there's a pretty wide spread here. We didn't see one thing stand out, which I think just emphasizes that there's a whole range of things that developers are grappling with. But the top of the list was discoverability and user acquisition right behind that, which are obviously very closely related issues. I mean, you've been in the industry a long time, Rob. This has obviously been a problem for quite a while, but discoverability, it feels like it's never been harder than it is right now.
Yeah, that's true. In the pre-IDFA days, and so before IDFA came to exist, a lot of developers relied on user acquisition campaigns. And so they would go to a Facebook or somebody else, and they would have the ability to buy a targeted user. And so what they would do is typically 30 to 40% of the game development budget went towards UA and marketing campaigns. So then they could bring the most valuable and most intentional user to their game, but they would be able to target them very specifically, bring them into their game. In the post-IDFA world, right, so they don't have the ability to target and acquire that user anymore. And so a lot of developers are heavily reliant on the marketplace itself. So the App Store, PlayStation Store, Xbox Store. But those storefronts are very, very crowded with a lot of IP. And so the challenge is, how do I break out and make sure that my content is seen and people know to download it? And so there's kind of two things, trends that are coming out of that we see, at least on the AccelByte side, and what the survey kind of backs up, is that one, people are looking at licensed IP. That brand familiarity is going to get their discovery. And then two, they're heavily reliant on analytics tools. And the purpose of analytics tools is really to make sure that they know as much about their player as possible. And so they look at player telemetry from the game to understand what they're doing. But then they also work to create a player 360 model where they can see player behavior across multiple platforms. Now, they don't know who the individual player is per se, but they do get to build a cohort to say something like, hey, I watched you, you watched a match 3 game on something like YouTube or Twitch. We know you downloaded a match 3 game. You probably like a match 3 game. Let's hopefully sell you a match 3 game. It isn't as robust as direct UA. And so that's why customers are saying discoverability is the biggest challenge right now, because they need to be able to shift and find new ways to be able to identify, target, and then bring that user to their game.
We're a couple of years on from IDFA now, obviously such a big upheaval in the industry, but do you feel like we're getting to the point now where developers are getting to grips with the new landscape and it's maybe not quite as scary as it looked like it was a couple of years ago?
I think it varies from small, medium, and large. So where large developers have the tools, they have large analytics teams, they can build these analytic pipelines, do A/B testing, do cohort segmentation, and then be able to target their user. For smaller developers, it's still a massive pain point, as we see here, in that they don't have access to those large analytics teams to help them go out and target. So they really got to rely on discovery from a store. And so that's one of the ways that AccelByte helps is we have a service called AccelByte Intelligence Service. And we provide, or we help provide, once built on AccelByte, some of that telemetry from within the game. And then we also have single identity and single authentication. And so as they plug into the various storefronts, they can then aggregate that all across AccelByte services and then be able to know more about their user. So still very much a challenge, depends on the size and scale of the developer. I think, though, with tools out there and more tools becoming available, it is becoming more accessible.
Yeah, and that really brings us on to the next thing on the list, back-end systems and just getting to grip with all of that. I mean, can you, this has been basically your whole career, but like just, can you sum up why that is such a big challenge?
Yes, no game is the same, and there's no one-size-fits-all model. So you imagine you're making a single-player MOBA, an RPG, an RTS. They all have different design philosophies, and they have different concepts of how they use back-end services. And so the challenge there is, okay, if I want to make a backend or I need to release a backend, where should I go and what service or tool should I use? And there's a lot of complexity in that decision making. So it really comes down to, what is your design philosophy? What do you want to get out of it? And how do you plug into it? And then there's also the second point with backend systems is talent pool. And so it relies on making sure that you have access to engineers who both know and understand the nuances of game development, but then are also very familiar with backend infrastructure and cloud infrastructure or on-premise infrastructure. And so the marriage of those two skill sets is a little more rare in the industry today. And so as people enter live service game development, that's one of the biggest hesitations. They go, well, I got to go hire a bunch of people. Where am I going to find those people? How do I get them trained up? And how long is that going to actually take me? And so with introduction of tools like AccelByte and other services out there, we remove a lot of that undifferentiated heavy lifting. So then game developers can just go, I'm going to focus on the creative element, let me make a game, and then they can leverage tools like AccelByte, which provides or creates more accessibility to then build and scale out that game.
That talent point is such a key one, isn't it? Because we had another question in the survey, I think 92%, 92% of developers said that finding backend live ops talent was a challenge at their studio, and it's easy to see why that's happened. I mean, we've got to a situation now where really quickly, almost 90% of revenue in the industry is coming from in-game purchases, in-game advertising, these kinds of live service revenue streams, and just the pool of back-end talent hasn't expanded at the rate to fill that gap.
That's correct. Again, we see it as an opportunity for all tools providers out there because it's creating a lot more accessibility. And so instead of having to spend a lot of time and resources finding who are those people, there's like a handful of them and everyone's fighting for the same 10 people that know how to do this, they're able to leverage tools to get there faster, quicker.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that really brings us on to kind of some of the next topics that we see on this slide. Competition, that's so tied up with discoverability. I mean, they're all two sides of the same coin, right? It's the fact that there are so many games out there is what makes standing out so difficult. And also, once you've acquired your users, holding on to them, retaining them in such a competitive landscape.
We're all fighting for eyeballs. And as we see so many live service games out there, there's only so many hours in the day, right? And so you're watching Netflix, you're doom scrolling through your Insta feed or whatever it is, and then you also want to play games. And typically people go to the game where their friends are. And so that's where the competition comes in, right? How do you get the person into the game? How do you make sure that you're retaining them as long as possible in that game experience? And then hopefully they don't go to the next one, but that's really the core pain point right now is just how do you get the person in? How do you have that content pipeline that's available to them to keep them engaged, keep them coming back day in, day in, day in?
Yeah. And that, I mean, how do you do that? Part of it is infrastructure, which is the last thing here. I mean, infrastructure costs, it's interesting to see that coming so high up. I mean, just how big a cost is infrastructure typically for a live service game?
It depends on the game itself. And so historically what we see is a single player game that's typically around 3% of your total revenue. And then that scales up by the complexity of the game itself. So single player game, 3% of total revenue. If you go up to a session-based multiplayer game, that's typically between 7 and 10% of your total revenue. And then when you go to something like a persistent open world game, that could be as much as 15% of your total revenue. And so infrastructure costs are continuing to scale, and we're continuing to kind of eat part of that overall revenue pie. And so the goal is how do you reduce that as much as possible? Certain parts of infrastructure are becoming commoditized in a way, and that's really game servers. Game servers are typically the most expensive part of your infrastructure. So when I say 7 to 10% of a session-based game of revenue, of that 7 to 10%, 50% of that will be game servers by itself. And that's where we always hear from developers, how do you make it cheaper, faster, and better? And so at AccelByte, we're always going to be looking, okay, how do we partner with other solution providers or bare metal to help reduce costs on behalf of our developers as much as possible? Especially in a live service game when you're looking at this really long tail of content. You have players coming in, but they're not always buying everything every day, but you have ongoing costs that are associated. And so we need to make sure that we're doing the best thing for developers, reducing it as much as possible. At AccelByte, our target is to reduce that to at least 1% of total revenue. And we think that by doing that, that's going to save developers a ton of money to be able to take that money and then reinvest in the game to create new immersive experiences, things that I want to go home and play.
And I think what you really see just when we talk through these topics, these big challenges in live service development, we keep circling around the big question, which is building versus buying. You can't avoid it. Like almost everything comes back to making this, or it's not even one decision, it's a series of decisions you need to make over and over again. So this is something that we dug into in a lot more detail in the survey by asking developers about why they made these decisions and what drove their preferences for buying versus building. So here we have the top reasons that live service developers gave for preferring to buy tools rather than building them themselves. And you see top of the list is the difficulty of maintaining the tools. It's not so much building them in the first place as now you have this thing that you're going to have to maintain forever.
Yeah, and the reason why this is up here is, so you think of like a larger studio, and we'll take context, maybe EA or somebody like that. EA has 30 plus studios around the world that are making individual games. And there's usually a central tech team that's responsible for building the tools to support them. What typically happens is each one of those game studios have custom requests. Hey, this needs to be tweaked for my specific game. And that becomes the build versus buy tension, because developers are always going to say, I can build it better for my game. And when they do that, what ends up happening is they build, but then they have to maintain that at every step of the way. And what happens is they end up taking resources and saying, okay, well, we built this really cool thing. Now we got to support it for as long as this game exists. We need more people. And they keep on adding more people to the paradigm, and then it keeps on stacking up, and then costs start to sprawl. And so in some cases, you can see teams of 50 plus people just working on tool development. That's a lot of burn for any studio. That's a lot of investment. And so what we say is, okay, you don't have to maintain those tools. Let us do that for you. And you guys, again, can focus on the creative elements. But maintaining the sprawl and the fragmentation and the branches, at some point it gets kind of out of control, especially if you are a larger developer supporting so many studios and they have so many requests. It just becomes unmanageable at a certain point.
And that really brings us on to the second thing on the list here is the reason for buying is it lets you focus more on the core of your game, because it's not just the cost, especially for smaller studios. It's just it's the distraction, it's the inability to focus. I mean that's got to be a huge part of the problem as well.
Yeah, and it's I mean, a lot of people get into the game development thing because they want to make something cool. And they want to create this story and this really immersive experience for people to get into. They don't want to spend time building authentication, login, back-end analytics systems. And they look at that and go, that's kind of boring. I want to be on the other team making the cool stuff and making the game. And so we want to help developers do that, right? We want to make sure that we're removing all that end differentiated heavy lifting. We want to do the boring stuff for them. We are game nerds. I'm a game technology nerd. And so I nerd out on that stuff, and I'm super passionate about it. So I'm just saying, let me do that, because that's what I love to do. You guys go focus on making the great game. Again, something that I want to go home and play later.
So we did also look at the flip side of this question and see what are the reasons that developers prefer to build. And some of this is interesting to dig into as well. And you see top of the list is concerns about flexibility. And you do hear critics saying that you buy a tool and maybe it gives you some dials to adjust, but it's not truly flexible. It doesn't really give me everything I need. So if I'm going to have the tool that gives me the full suite, I have to build it myself. I mean, is there some truth to that?
Very much. As I was saying earlier, everybody wants to do it themselves, and it's not one size fits all. So everyone has specific requirements to be able to customize into their game. And so the number one piece of feedback that we get from AccelByte is specifically that. How do I customize for my own game? And that typically comes in two flavors. A developer will come to us and say, hey, I need something custom built for this game. We're going to look at it and go, one, does that add value to a whole bunch of developers? If yes, we're going to help them build that, but then we're also going to bring it back to the platform and make sure that's generally available for everyone. If no, we're still going to help them build that. And we do that via a service called Extend, where a developer can create their own custom code. And that custom code can overwrite the logic of our core platform. And then when they write that code, it's a low-code environment. Not a no-code, but low-code environment. They take that, they put it in a microservice, then we host that for them. They can overwrite some of the logic in our platform and be able to have that extensibility. But that is the number one issue that comes up in the build versus buy. How do you continue, or how do I do custom dev? How do I continue to support it? And what happens if my game changes or something changes? Who's responsible for that in the long term? And again, we want to make sure that we're taking that heavy lift off the developers and making that a reason not to buy, right? We want them to buy, and so we want to remove all the fear and uncertainty as they're making that decision and make sure that they have all the right tools to make sure they can customize for their game themselves.
But then there is, what's really interesting, of course, is that we see a lot of this stuff here. The concerns are, they're fundamentally technical, but some of them are kind of broader, almost philosophical, which is, if you it might be a lot of work to build your own tools, but then you own them and there's no one responsible for them but you. And we do see this concern that, okay, well, if it's the best tool in the world, I buy it in, and then the vendor gets shut down or they get acquired, the product hits ends of life. I mean, that's obviously a big concern. You must hear that from developers as well.
We do. It is probably one of the most commonly requested things when we're actually doing our developer agreements. People say, well, is AccelByte going to be around? And what happens if you get bought by the next big tech company? What happens to my game? What happens to my code? And so what we do is being very developer obsessed and customer obsessed. We work with those developers and say, in the rare case that we potentially disappear or were acquired, we would then provide the developer with a royalty, a perpetual license and royalty-free license to the game code or to the platform code. They would be able to use that code to maintain their player experience. They wouldn't be able to use that code to create any other kind of commercial business or move it to any other games. We just want to make sure that in the rare event that something does happen, they have the ability to continue to support their player base. And that's really the most important thing. If any tool provider disappears, the player is really the one that gets the impact from that, right? Because then the developer can no longer support them. Maybe they're feature limited. And so we always want to make sure that we're providing them with the tools to be sustainable in the event that we no longer exist. But that combined with, I think the other one that's up here is vendor lock-in. I think that's number
4 here.
Number 4, yeah. Vendor lock-in as well. The other concern is just, if I go with you, can I get away if something changes? And again, we want to make it customizable and extensible. And so we're always going to provide the right tools to help customers make that right decision and make sure that they can maintain their player experience at the end of the day.
And I think we can see that although there's still a lot of uncertainty, there are arguments in both directions. The direction of travel is really clear, and I think this is something that came through in the survey. When we asked developers, are they using external technology more or less than you were 5 years ago? And we got 94% say that they're using more external technology. So, it's not happening overnight, but at the same time, I think we can see pretty clearly the direction that live service developers are moving in.
Yeah, we've seen a tectonic shift, a big shift in the industry. And I think one of the other data points that we got out of the survey earlier was, and I don't think we have the slide here, but one of the data points that we saw was that of all the live service developers, traditionally going in, people would say live service games are only meant for or can only be accomplished by the biggest developers who can support those large teams and can support the content pipeline. And what we saw in the survey results was that I think it was a little more than half, was it? Of those developers were 100 people or less studios.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what we see is that a lot more studios that are smaller in size, they have the ability, the barrier to entry is much lower via tools, and they have the ability to then get in and start making those live service games. And so what we've seen is stealing a phrase from Unity, but we've seen the democratization of live service games in that it's now accessible for everyone. They're able to use these tools to make the live service games and be productive and not have to worry about that continual sprawl and the just high barrier to entry. And the big thing there is, in a typical studio scenario, what you would see is that total cost of ownership. So what total cost of ownership is, one, you have to pay for all of the infrastructure. You have to pay for all of the tools. You have to pay for all the resources. Then you have to pay for all of the overhead, which could be physical, like an office and or internet or other things. Total cost of ownership for making a live service game, and especially having back-end developers, you could potentially be investing 50 people, hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. And again, that's very scary when people look at it and they go, well, TCO is way too high. I will never make that money back. So how do I get there faster? And so then they look at external tools and say, okay, maybe this external tool is a tenth of what my TCO might be. And so instead of spending $50 million and having a team of 50, now you can have a team of 2 and spend maybe $5 million, hopefully cheaper. And on our platform, we've seen exactly that. And so we have a few customers who have been able to build out and scale their platform with 2 people. Instead of hiring 50, they've been able to hire 2, plug into the system, leverage a lot of the extensibility and the scalability that we provide, not have to think about anything else. And so, again, what we're trying to do is lower that total cost of ownership to hopefully around 1%, probably 1.5%, depending on the game. And that's 1.5% of total revenue. And then that becomes really, really interesting for developers when they say, okay, I can actually create a sustainable long-term business off of this. And so I think, again, we see it in the data here, a lot of developers are moving towards that model where they're saying, hey, I don't want to invest in building these large teams. I don't want to maintain this for the next 5, 10, 15 years. Hopefully, if they have that success, why don't I just work with a developer, buy something off the shelf?
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much we can say about this topic, but I think something that we want to just touch on before we wrap up here is, say, more developers, they are making that decision, they are going to buy in technology, and then now they have a choice to make. Who are they going to pick to do the job for them? So we asked, what they saw as the most important qualities. It's interesting that top of the list here is proven track record. I think we've touched on this as well. This is very much related to concerns about loss of service, vendor lock-in. There's some really interesting ones here. I don't know if there's anything you want to pick out to focus on. I think customizability, we see extensibility here, source code access, these kinds of things. This is pretty high on the qualities that developers are expecting to see, right?
Yeah. So proven track record, number one, our industry works on word of mouth. The industry is so small. You have a great experience, you tell your friend, he has a great experience, they tell 10 other friends, they have a great experience, and so then we see this ripple effect throughout the industry. And so number one is just making sure that you're doing the best thing for your developer and they have that positive experience, because word of mouth will help sell. Number two here, cross-platform. This is actually what I see and have heard throughout GDC this entire week. Especially with the problems with discovery and IDFA and everything else. People are saying, okay, well, how do I create a cross-platform experience? On PC console, can I plug in my mobile experience? What does that look like, and how do I tap more users? Because at the end of the day, players don't really care. They just want to pick up their game and have that seamless experience, whether it's console, PC, be able to play with their friends in a multiplayer game, whether they're on console and I'm on PC. And so those are big. Extensibility, again, we touched on that earlier. We've heard that a lot, just making sure that you can directly integrate into your game, not one size fits all, and you have that ability to customize where you need around the edges. And I think the last one, which is 21% here, I feel it should be higher, and it's probably one of the most important things, is high level of customer support. And so as you're using a tool, and you're using that tool, and maybe you run into an issue, you don't want to just throw a question or a support thing at a forum and hope somebody comes back and answers that. You want to make sure that there's a human on the other side of that, and that can help you immediately. And so what we do is that we have varying levels of support with our product. And so we have a free tier of our product where you can get started very, very quickly and easily. You get in, you start using. If you do have questions along the way, you can access our community forum, and it's managed by AccelByte engineers on the other side. And then as your game continues to scale, we go from kind of a reactive to a proactive model. And what that means is at the bottom tier of your game starting to scale, you have a trouble ticket system. We have a bunch of people that can help support that. We have on-call engineers and SAs that will help you support and resolve that issue. And then if you're scaling crazy and you've got some great YouTube promotion or Twitch streamer that's promoting your game and it's taking off, then we scale our support with you as well. And it scales up to where at the point we have dedicated technical producers, dedicated account managers. We set up a Slack channel with our developer so they can get those immediate real-time answers. And what we found is support is a product in itself, and it's probably one of the, again, I think it's low here, but one of the most important things to being successful as a developer.
All right. As I said, I think we could go on all day, but I mean, thank you so much for all those amazing insights. I do want to leave just a couple of minutes for Q&A. So thank you everyone for listening to the talk. And if you have a question, please do run up to the microphone.
Hello, hi. You mentioned earlier that at AccelByte you listen to feature requests from different developers, and at some point have a way to decide whether a feature request could be beneficial for all the other ecosystem of developers that use that. How do you prioritize that?
There's a little bit of a plus one, and so what we look to is get as much customer voice as possible or developer voice as possible. And so if one developer comes to me and says, hey, that's really cool and I need it for my game, then we go out and we talk to a bunch of other developers in the community and say, do you think that would be valuable as well? And if we get a lot more plus ones, then we say, yes, the customer needs that. Let's make sure that we prioritize that in the benefit. If we only have one, then we say, okay, that's unique to you. It's probably an edge case. We'll continue to help support that developer, but it probably won't become a feature unless we get a bunch of people asking for that thing. So we always want to make sure we're working backwards from the community and doing what they need as a whole.
So just to make sure that I understand, if there's a feature request from a specific developer, you do like a reach out to all the other developers through your platform and get a feedback on whether they need that feature.
That's correct. And then we also host things like Advisory Council, where we put a bunch of developers in a room and we go through the roadmap and we ask developers, stack rank our roadmap. Tell us what you think is most important. We have a bunch of engineers who are going to make cool things that they like, but we want to make sure we're focused on the right things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
All right. Well, once again, thank you all for coming. As always, it wouldn't be a GDC session without a reminder to please fill out your evaluation forms. And I hope you had a great time this morning. Thank you.